Hey everyone, welcome to COV Works. My name is Josh, and today we're going to be painting up some German Veteran Infantry, some of the new models from Warlord Games. I'll show you how I paint them and talk about the gear and stuff a little bit. And let me know down in the comments if you want to hear more about gear and history as I paint. And let's get started. Alrighty, so let's get started. First things first, this channel is sponsored by myself, so if you want to support me, check the links down in the description. First thing I'll do to start painting is do a zenithal highlight from the Citadel rattle cans, which means just base coating them in black and then doing a sharp highlight in white to simulate shadows. First thing I'll do is I'll start with Corpse Pale from the Army Painter to just hit all of the skin. Now you can see here I'll mix this up. I like to mix it with some water and I'll thin it out a lot. When you paint it on, you'll notice what'll happen is you'll see some of the exposed parts of the face and it's going to be very, very runny. I do that on purpose just to be able to hit it with multiple coats so you can see the eyes pretty clearly. You'll notice it goes on super duper thin. It'll take a few different coats, but I'll just lather that on all of the arms and faces. It doesn't matter if it hits the weapons or the helmet or anything else like that, just because I'm trying to do a base coat. And I'll usually start painting from bottom to top. So just imagine you're putting on clothes. The first thing you'll start with is skin, and then you'll work your way up. From there, what I'm going to do is I am going to use Vallejo German Field Gray for all of the uniform. If you'd like, you can do the pants and Splinter camo as well, but for the helmets, and I'm going to be doing the Splinter camo, and I'll be, not hitting those because these specific models have the cover on. So for the Vallejo Field Gray, I'll put that on a wet palette and I'll mix it with some water just to thin it out. I like to thin it quite a bit because I'm going to be doing multiple layers of this when I highlight later on. So if it's pretty thin, don't worry about it. Just make sure you're watching for bubbles and just pretty much making sure that it's not quite too thin. I don't want to be doing multiple base coats. So you can see here, I'll just start lathering it on both the jacket and the pants. If you'd like, you could use a little bit more of a gray color for the pants just to give some contrast between the trousers and the jacket. But for this video, I'm just covering everything in the German Field Gray. And, there's not quite too many correct colors for this. They produce so many variants with some, different tones on them. So I like the Vallejo paints the best, so that's what I'm using in this video. But you can see here, I'm just going through and just completely highlighting and just coating everything pretty thick, making sure that I'm not hitting any bubbles, but I have thinned this paint down quite a bit again, which is just mixing it with a little bit of water to do the first base coat. Now don't worry too much about getting this field gray on the boots or the Kar 98 pouches or anything like that, because we're going to go back over everything. Again, when I'm painting, I like to start from the bottommost layer, working my way up. So after you paint the skin, you'll put on the clothes, and then on top of your clothes, you're going to be putting on your field gear. So the field gear is what I'd paint after that. And so, I'm just giving this a heavy coat on everything. Again, the paint is pretty thin. You're going to want to make sure you're not getting any streaks from your brush. That shows you've got a little bit too much paint and not enough water to thin it down. But if you're putting it on and you're not seeing any brush strokes, then you are in a pretty decent spot. Ironically, with all the experience I have with World War II equipment, you'd think I'd be a little bit more stingy about making sure everything's period correct. But the main thing I like to do is I just like to make sure that everything looks good from tabletop and it's recognizable, even if it's not technically period correct, despite being a historical war game. So the next thing I'm going to do is I'm going to do the Splinter camo helmet covers. I'm going to use the Army Painter combat fatigues for the helmet cover. And then on the side here, you can see I forgot to paint the base coat, but we're going to be doing the helmet on the right side that doesn't have a cover. It's just that bare metal. I'm going to be mixing a little bit of German camo dark green with Necromancer cloak. So we'll start with the Splinter camo helmet covers. So I'm just going to thin the heck out of this Army Painter combat fatigue. You can see it's a little bit out of focus here, but the combat fatigue from the Army Painter, at least the one I have, is just absolutely the worst paint to paint with. It just is so thick and just doesn't work great. So I really have to thin it down quite a bit. You can thin it down with some Lamy medium if you want, but I pretty much just use water and do multiple coats. And so I'll just, completely saturate this thing. You don't want it to bubble or clump up too much, but I thin it down, do a couple different coats for the combat fatigues, and then from here I'll kind of use the paint to clean up some of the skin tone that's underneath the helmet from when I just completely lathered it on there. So just completely cover the helmet, and then I'll also do the rolled up pouch in the back. I don't think it's a Zeltbahn, but it might be. I'm sure it'll look fine if anybody asks. It's a Zeltbahn. If not, if it's just a sleeping bag, nobody will know. Nobody will know what it is. So we'll just completely cover that, and then do multiple coats and see where we're at. And if you might even need a third coat, who knows. Now, when you're working on different German or any historical World War II uniforms for that matter, if you need somewhere to reference for what the colors and everything is going to look like, I highly recommend looking at the website at the front. They do equipment that's been reproduced for historical reenactors, and they are very hardcore about what is acceptable and what isn't. So if you're not sure what the Splinter camo looks like, or any other camo for that matter, check out their website for a reference. I'm using their Splinter camo photos for my miniatures. They have a green and tan based Splinter camo, and I'm going to be using the green based camouflage for mine just because I think green looks a little bit better on the tabletop, and tan makes me want to die when I try to plan it for Splinter camo. For the helmet, like I said, I just did a mix of 50-50 of the German dark green and the Necromancer cloak. I don't actually know if that really makes a difference mixing in that green, but that's what I do for the helmet. I'll thin it down pretty good and just completely lather that thing on, and then I'll just hit it with a wash later on, and then just a quick dry brush of some lighter gray to make it stand out. It's not really anything fancy for the helmets, but otherwise, any dark gray would work just fine. They do sometimes have a slight green tint to them, but yeah, otherwise I'll just thin this paint down and I'll just completely cover it on. I'm probably putting too much paint on there, but it's gonna look fine when it's over. Alrighty, so now comes the hard part of Splinter camo. This camo is really, really difficult. It's actually my least favorite to do out of all the German World War II camos, but we're going to be painting some different squares and triangles, and we're going to be using a mix of German dark green camo with army green, and then chocolate brown, and then we're also going to be shading it with the military shade. I'm going to do the green triangles and squares first, and then shading it with the military shade, and then the chocolate brown. For this, I highly recommend a very, very thin 00 brush, because the main thing I've noticed with Splinter camo is with the different patterns and squares and triangles on it, they've got to be extremely sharp in order to look good. So again, this is not an easy camo to do. If it doesn't look good, don't be discouraged. It took me like 30 models to get it right, and I still don't know if I even like it. So first things first, we'll do the different green shapes. So here you can see I'm mixing up the German camo dark brown and army green. German camo dark brown. It's German camo dark green and army green. And I'm just going for a medium green here. I probably could have just bought a paint that sufficed, but I'm mixing things just to make things harder on myself. If you're looking for what kind of paints to use, honestly, what I would do is just download some pictures on your phone and take them to the game store and hold them up next to the paints there and see what looks close enough. So here I'm going to show you how I kind of do the patterns on the Splinter camo. So I'm actually just showing how I paint with some water. And essentially on Splinter camo, you're looking for, rectangles with triangles attached to them. So you can see I'm trying to just outline a triangle pattern here with some water here on the painting tabletop. And what I'll do is I'll outline the shape I want, and then I'll go through and I will fill it in with the rest of the paint. And kind of doing it like you would draw with a pencil, just doing lots of tiny strokes just to get the general outline of the shape, and then doing it on the actual model itself. So I'm going to grab the model here and throw it on the tabletop and start outlining my first shape. So we'll get some green on the paintbrush and get the model down. And I'm just going to go for an outline of the first shape I want. It's pretty much just rectangles with triangles attached to them for Splinter camo. So you can see I can start doing the first outline. My hands are super shaky and I'm doing a terrible job because I'm trying to film at the same time. But usually I hold this model like right up next to my face. You can see I don't use a model stand because I'm a freak. And just try to outline a little triangle, and then I'll maybe throw another triangle on the other side. But the main thing with this camouflage is trying to get those points as sharp as possible. So off camera here, you can see I do my first little triangle. You can see how sharp it is. And then I'll add another little triangle off camera here again, and just pretty much do the same thing on the roll. I'll probably do 3 or 4 different triangles and rectangles on the helmet cover, and then do the same thing on the Zeltband roll. And then if I do the same thing on pants or jackets or whatever, you know, bunch of little triangles and rectangles. And then I'll come back later on and do the same exact thing with chocolate brown. But here you can see I'm just making this a little bit more rectangular and making it roll off the side of the helmet cover. On the Zeltband roll on his pack, it's going to be a lot easier because you can just kind of throw some colors down. You don't need as sharp of shapes as you would need for the helmet cover. Alrighty, so you can see off camera I painted in some more triangles and rectangles all over these guys' helmet covers and on the roll on the rifleman's back. Again, you know, just random rectangles and triangles attached to each other. If you need a reference photo, again, I'd recommend at the front. And the next thing we're going to do is just go ahead and shade it. I'm not going to do the brown shapes until I shade it first with War Paint Fanatics military shade, and the reason being is I want the brown to stand out, and if I use a green shade wash, it's not going to look good next to brown. It just changes the color slightly. So we'll start with the Army Painter military shader. Any green, dark green military camo shade will work. So we'll put that on the helmet covers, and we're really just going to lather this thing on. I will try to make sure when I lather it on here, you can see I do a little bit too much, and it's actually blurring the transition from the light green and the dark green. So I'll lather it on because I want to get the folds and the creases of the helmet cover. But then once I'm done, I'll kind of dry out my brush a little bit and wick away from some of the spots that show the difference between the light and the dark green, because I really want those sharp edges to stand out as much as possible on the helmet cover and on the rolls. You know, if you put too much shade on, then it's going to blur the lines and it's just going to ruin all the effort you put into making triangles. So you can see I'm kind of drying off my brush on a paper towel and then wicking it away from the high points of the helmet cover, just so we can make sure we can get sharp edges and you can tell what it is. Now, later on, I'll be doing a wash all over the model. I like to go heavy on the washes and also heavy on highlights. I probably make my model a little bit too light, but the main thing is I like to know what I'm looking at from the tabletop. A lot of people like to use really dark washes, and it looks a little bit more realistic, but you know, I like to go really heavy on washes and then highlight a lot just because I like to see from the tabletop what I'm looking at and be able to tell immediately that I'm okay at painting. Well, supposedly okay at painting. Now again, this painting guide is for the green-based Splinter camo. If you want to do a tan-based Splinter camo, again, reference at the front for their tan reversible Zeltbond Splinter camo pattern. They can show you what the tan looks like. So if I was doing tan, I would just do the same exact process. Instead of the military shader, I might use something like Skeleton Horde from the Army Painter, use a khaki base, and then probably use the same green and chocolate brown for the shapes and patterns on top of that. On the rolls and the pants, I'll probably go even heavier on the wash. You can see that I'm doing that here because I'm really trying to make the rolls and folds stand out as much as possible. It's kind of like when you go to the beach, you know, you want those rolls and folds to, you know, just really grab everyone's attention when you're walking down the sand. Alrighty, so next up, I'm going to be using chocolate brown to add those shapes onto the Splinter camo covers, as well as any slings and leather pouches, Iraqi sand for the bread bags, and then German dark camo green for any of the metal accessories like the little mess tin. The water bottle cover, I'll usually just make a dark brownish black, but alrighty, so let's start with chocolate brown, and I'm going to repeat the chocolate brown process for the shapes on the Splinter camo cover. So you can see I'm using this 00 really thin brush again. We're going to keep it really nice and pointed. We don't want the paint to bead up at the end of the brush. And we're just going to copy the process that we did for the shapes on the helmet cover with the dark green, with the dark brown. It's fine if the dark brown touches the green. You know, we just want to make sure that if we're doing that, that all of the shapes are clearly defined and you can tell them apart with your eye. So you can see the different shape patterns. It doesn't really work great as a camo, so to speak, because you can see what you're looking at, but it really looks great on tabletop if you can clearly define shapes with the eye. So you can see right here, I'm just adding a brown triangle rectangle shape with the camera completely out of focus next to this green one. I promise that later on it'll get it in a little bit of focus. If you can't tell, it's very hard to paint very sharp lines with a camera right in front of my face as I'm painting. So just adding a little triangle here, getting a little bit more paint. I'm twisting the brush on the wet palette to make sure that I'm not getting any beading at the end of my brush, and then, you know, just going through adding random triangles and shapes. When you're painting camouflage, less is always more, in my opinion. I like to see very clearly defined shapes and colors and patterns, because again, when the model is on the tabletop, I want to know immediately when I'm looking at it, oh, that's Splinter camo. I did an okay job doing that. So you can see I did the rest of these off camera. Again, triangles, rectangles, looks fantastic. And then I'm just going to take my chocolate brown while I already have it out and do all the slings and pouches, and then the Iraqi sand for the bread bags. Now, Iraqi sand might be a little bit too yellow for the bread bags and stuff, but I'm not going crazy with all the correct colors on these German models, because the Germans were not thinking of us when they were designing their equipment, and I'm pretty mad at them for that. They decided to make everything 500,000 different colors instead of the Americans, which was like 3 colors. So just to save myself pain and suffering, I like to do as few colors as possible on the German units, because switching between 30 different paints is just an absolute pain. So you can see here on the little bread bag, I'm just using Iraqi sand. Again, it's probably a little bit too yellow, but that's fine. It's all fine here. I just hate painting 30 different colors. So paint the bread bag, and then any other thing that might be, you know, a similar color. Some of the Fallschirmjäger and some of the veterans have like leg wraps that they have on their boots. I'll paint them in the same exact color. And one thing you could do at the very end is you could go through and highlight up all of the little pouches and accessories. Generally, the only thing I like to do highlights on are the largest parts of the model, which is namely going to be the uniform. You know, highlights are just a pain, and they add a lot of time onto your model making. And, you know, I like suffering, so usually I'll spend about an hour per model. And so, you know, Horde Armies and I are best friends in that case. So here you can see I'm just taking that chocolate brown, and with the camera completely out of focus, I'm going to be doing this on the Kar 88 slings. Kar 88 slings are pretty much just a flat leather brown, so, you know, if you go darker or lighter, it's not really going to matter too much. Again, I'm not trying to paint everything perfectly historically correct. I'm just trying to make it look like what it's supposed to look like on tabletop, so it's immediately recognizable. My colors are never generally historically perfectly accurate, but I'm not concerned about that as much as I am concerned about a good-looking model on the tabletop that looks like a German veteran. Now you can see here I'm taking a little bit of extra time painting up the leather sling. As we start with our base coats, you know, I usually just try to go heavy and paint everything I possibly can, and as we go higher and higher in our layers, I like to take my time, so I have to do less cleanup at the end. So you can see I'm really taking my time here with the leather sling because it goes around the guy's arm. He's using that kind of to help stabilize the rifle as he's aiming down the sights, which is nice little detail on these models. These German Veteran Infantry models are really great. There's a lot of little, you know, niche details that you can tell they actually, you know, did a little bit of research on how these guys would shoot and what the actual soldiers of the day would do to fire. On this MG34 gunner here, he's got a little small parts pouch here. I'm just painting that bit up in brown. Any pouch you're not really sure what it is or what it does, you know, brown is probably pretty safe. We can just assume it's leather. I've seen so many pouches from, you know, Germany in World War II that, you know, it was always one color until you find an exception. I'm using the same chocolate brown for the canteen covers. These have a lot of different colors on them. I've seen people do different colors, but again, I'm trying to paint as little as possible and make it look good enough. So the next thing we're going to be doing is German dark green. I'm going to be using this for the little mess tins, and I'll also use this for any other small metal parts like the drum magazine for the MG34. And then I'm going to use Vallejo light brown for all the wood accessories. You can probably get away with doing a bunch of different wood types on all the Kar 98 rifles and the MG34 stocks. I've seen them in light brown and dark brown and bakelite, and it's not going to really matter too much what you do. But for the ease of painting, I'm going to be using the same color. So here's that Vallejo German dark green. I'll leave all the paints in the descriptions. That way you can easily see them and you can, reference them without having to go back, because apparently I'm talking very quickly. So we're going to be painting up this little mess tin. And again, this dark green I like to use for anything that's German metal. So mortars, ammo cans, the drum magazines for the different MGs. I'll use this Vallejo German dark green on. Now, while I've got this green out, I'm actually going to use that to add some of the raindrop streaks on the Splinter camo helmet covers and rolls. The German camo dark green looks good on it. If you want, you could also use a black or something, because some of these raindrop streaks do appear over the brown and green splotches, and so if you want to make those very noticeable, I might even use a darker color, maybe mix some black with this dark green. But I'm mostly just going to be doing it on the combat fatigues color on the helmet cover. Just a couple of them, just to show that I put in the effort to do the raindrop pattern. And, I'm doing it off camera here a little bit just because it's extremely difficult. And I'll probably just add, 5 or 6 on the helmet covers just so you can see what it is and know that I'm putting in the effort, but not enough to hate myself. One interesting tidbit about the Splinter camo is it actually inspired a lot of different camos post-war. You can actually see inspiration from the Splinter camo both on Eastern and Western Germany. The West German border guards, they used a form of Splinter camo before they transitioned to just kind of a generic green. And the East German communist side, they had a raindrop camo. And, that was kind of inspired from some of these raindrops on the Splinter camo. So a lot of German World War II equipment inspired a lot of equipment on both sides of the wall after the war. So pretty interesting. And you can see here I'm just doing it on the MG34 gunner as well. I usually try to pick a single direction and act like the raindrops are all pointing up towards the center of the helmet. I don't know if that's technically correct, but, the vertical lines are going to be easier to notice for the human eye, so everything's kind of pointing up towards the very top crest of the helmet, I guess towards the crown of the head. And you can see here this guy, he's got some goggles on him with the Splinter camo splotches as well as the raindrops. I'll just go completely over that goggle strap because we're going to be coming back over that later on anyways, so it doesn't really matter if we get paint on it. And that kind of ends the raindrop camo on both those guys. All right, so the next thing we'll be doing is painting all the wood parts of the rifles. Now, you could do the metal parts first, but for this video, I decided to just use the Vallejo light brown and do the wood first. So we'll do it on the MG34 buttstock as well as the Kar 98 rifle. Later on, I'll be doing a little bit of a wash on these just to add some contrast. But for now, we'll just paint the stock and the stock on the Kar 98. This paint is completely awful because it's a yellow base paint, so I have to thin it down and do multiple coats on it. So, anything that's kind of leaning yellow is just absolutely terrible and usually requires multiple coats. It's super thick and it just never does what I want it to. So I always end up going thinner, and then it runs into all the crevices, and then I have to clean it up, and it's just completely awful. So take your time. Don't rush the yellow-based paints because they will make you cry and make you curse whoever makes those paints. I don't know why yellow does it. If anybody knows why yellow does that, if it's some sort of dye, that makes it just the worst to paint with, let me know down in the comments. I'd love to know, so I know who to be mad at whenever I'm painting these. So got the MG34 stock, and then the Kar 98 rifle. There's some parts on the Kar 98 where the wood is lower than some of the metal bits, and then there's some metal bits that are lower than where the wood is, so it really doesn't matter which one you do first or second. But you can see here I'm just doing the wood. There's a little barrel band that retains the upper handguard, and you can see I just leave that alone so I can come back and paint it a little bit easier. And I'm just going around and just kind of lathering this orangish, brownish, yellowish color on. Right underneath the bolt of the gun, there is a little magazine well. So on the side here where his right and left arm, in between there, I'll paint that color, and then I'll come back through and paint the bottom of the rifle with a dark gray just to show the magazine well. But you can see here I'm just kind of painting it. Anything that's metal, it doesn't matter if I hit with this wood color, because I'm going to be coming back and painting over top of it anyways. It's really easy to come back and clean things up with darker colors, but with lighter colors it's a little bit harder. So in the case of the Kar 98 or any wood stock based rifle, I'd probably do the wood first, just because if you make any mistakes, it's easier to clean up with a darker color, whereas if you were to clean this model up with a wood stock color, it might take a couple of coats, and just, you know, any extra seconds I can save on painting a model and actually getting them on the tabletop will make me happy, because these guys already take long enough as it is, and painting 30 of them just takes so much of my life. Now I'm going to do the back end of the buttstock, and to save myself time too, I'm going to use the same wood color on all of the stick grenade handles and any of the buttstocks and, not buttstocks, wood handles on the shovels and entrenching tools. Anything wood, we're just going to use the same color on, just to try to do as little as possible. If you want to use kind of a light brown, that would be fine. The main thing is I like to pick colors that are going to stand out so you can immediately distinguish them between other parts of the model. Again, I always do that 6-foot rule of what looks good on tabletop. Even though I'm looking at it really closely with my eye, I like to make sure that things, you know, look good when I'm really far away. You can see right there I accidentally got a little bit of the wood color on the helmet cover. So whenever I do that, I'll just wash off my brush and just get a little bit of water on it and just go back over it. Especially if I don't want to do any more cleanup work on a part that I may have accidentally gotten paint on. If I just get a little bit of water and then just brush it off, it'll usually just come straight off and I won't have to do any cleanup work. For this stick grenade here, you can see I'm just painting it on. I'm not doing a very detailed close-up job because you're not really going to be able to tell, and the wash that I did on the Zeltband cover, it'll make those recesses really dark anyways, and so you're not really going to be able to tell that I didn't fully cover the stick grenade, and you know, unless you're looking really, really close at it. So maybe your best friend will notice and make fun of you for your paint job, but you know, anybody else at the game store will only quietly think it. They won't say it to your face. So you can see here, I'm just painting up the handle of the folding entrenching tool. These entrenching tool designs were used pretty late after the war by both sides. You can see, especially in the Soviet bloc, they've got that folding handle design with the solid wood stick. The Americans went pretty quickly to a complete folding design with a metal handle. And, you know, that's just because they had the production capacity, whereas wood was cheap in the Soviet Union. So pretty interesting little fact there. That same design is used pretty widely across the Soviet Union after the war. Here on the other side here, you can see you got to pay attention to these German infantry models because some of them have stick grenades stuck in random places. Definitely a veteran army thing to do is just take as many grenades as you possibly can with you. And so just make sure you're keeping an eye on those. And then you can see here I'm using ashen gray for all of the metal bits on the rifles. So this paint comes pretty thin, as do some of the Citadel paints. So I don't really add a lot of water onto it. And the main thing is when you paint things on, same with the German field gray, you'll notice that there's a little bit of lighter color if you thin it properly on some of the high points. And that's exactly what you want. You want the white undercoat to come through just a tiny bit, and it's kind of acting like a little bit of a highlight that's done for you. And when we add a wash later on, it'll really just help. So On the 34 here, you can see I'm covering everything with metal. I think the grips were technically had a handle on them. I'm probably lying about that. I'm trying to remember. But we're just going to paint everything in metal just for the sake of ease. And then you can see here this paint's pretty thinned out, and so some of the high points are going to stay closer to a white color. And then we're going to come back over later on and wash this gun all with Knoll oil, same with the Car 98, just to show some of the holes drilled into the barrel shroud, and just kind of give a little bit of contrast for some of the little different metal work that they do on these guys. The weapon designs are pretty good on these German infantry models, and the Victrix models have a little bit more detail to them, but overall they're pretty good. And boy, can I just not stop talking. I gotta fill the void with talking, don't I, on this video? It's crazy. Let me know down in the comments if you want to hear more World War II facts, or if you just want me to talk less and let you watch the video. It'll be interesting to see what you say. Now, I like using Eschen gray for all of the German weapons. It kind of has a little bit of a blue hue to it, same with the Knoll oil. Germany pretty much blued most of their guns during the war, so any subtle blue colors would work really great. Here you can see I'm actually using that same Eschen gray on the middle of the belted ammunition. They used these blued links for all their MG34s and 42s. And then here you can see I'm just using that same Eschen gray on the Car 98. We can be pretty liberal with this color, and then just make sure that you're being careful doing the barrel band and the bolt and butt stock of the rifle. So the next thing we're going to be doing is my favorite part, which is washing everything. For the field gray uniform, we're going to be doing a 50-50 mix of Knoll oil and Lamium Technical Medium, and then we're going to be using a thick coat of Skeleton Horde for the faces. I'm going to start there with the Skeleton Horde. This is my favorite quick skin recipe. If I was really spending time on a model, maybe if it was a hero model for a different game or something, I like to use less washes, just I think it looks a little bit more professional. But the Skeleton Horde over Corpse Pale is the recipe I use for all the skin. You can see the Corpse Pale is very bright, and then when I take the Skeleton Horde, I will literally just absolutely soak this thing. Not soak it too much, but the Skeleton Horde adds a lot of nice shadows to everything. You could use Cadian Flesh Tone from Citadel, but this is just what I've been using for a long time, and I'm too cheap to go buy more paints. That would probably make my life a little bit easier. So you can see here I'm just lathering this on the face and neck, and sometimes I'll dot in a little bit more just to make sure the eye sockets and creases on the nose and mouth stand out. And same with the hands. I want a lot of that Skeleton Horde to fall in the recesses between the fingers, just because I want to be able to see exactly the difference between all the fingers and all the clearly defined shapes. You can see I'm a madman, and I don't use a stand for all my models, and so I just grab it by the base and drop it 1,000 times. I should probably do a drop counter. Now for the uniform, I'm mixing up that Technical Medium and Knoll oil and just doing a pretty good mix, and I am just going to absolutely lather this on the model. You could almost maybe even dip these models if you're brave enough. I like to use different washes for different parts of the model just because I feel like it looks a little bit better. I try to use washes that match whatever I am washing, so if it's a very bright green or very clearly green color, I like to use green washes, skin tone washes for skin tones, etc., etc. Knoll oil looks pretty much good with everything. It's, there's a reason why it's so famous. And then I'm just going to be completely covering this model in the Knoll oil and Technical Medium mix. You can see here, the purpose of this is just to really get it in the folds and creases of this model. We really want to clearly see where the folds are on the cloth uniform. You can see I bumped the camera there, very professional. And, wherever there's web gear that is sitting on top of his cloth uniform, I really want to lay it on thick because I want that to dry and show really stark shadows and contrast and all the folds and all the web gear. Again, the purpose being that I want to be able to see the model from 6 feet and clearly see the web gear and the different equipment that he's got on, because I put so much effort into painting it anyways that I might as well be able to tell. So you can see, boom, look how thick that is. Nice. And we'll just throw that on there. My thumb's blocking all of the relevant thing you want to see. So, big thumbs, what are you going to do? Actually, I have small hands. Alrighty, so next up, we're going to be doing the eyes, which is just absolute pain. Again, I'm going to be using my super thinned out brush. I use pretty crappy brushes for all the base coats, and then I'll get out my nice thin brushes for all the details. And you can see here, pretty much what I like to do is just get an absolute tiny bead of white paint and then just slowly swipe my hand and move my hand closer and closer where I want the eyes to be as I go. So you can see I've got an absolute tiny amount of white here, and I'll start making stroking motions and just slowly move my hand more towards the eye. And the second I kind of get it where I want it to do, I'll pull away. It's kind of hard to see on camera here, and it's very hard to do the eyes in front of the camera. Drop the model again. But again, yeah, just do that stroking motion and then just slowly move your hand towards where you want the white of the eye to be. And, once you hit that white, you can just pull straight away. And that's what I like to do, is just straight lines for the eyes. And you can see here, when I do one side of the eye or the other, if he's holding a rifle, I'll flip the model upside down. And, I probably should use a handle, but I like to get my hands all over the model just so there's a natural formation of Cheeto dust. I don't have to add that in later on. I'll also do a base coat of white on the goggles and everything, because we'll be doing blue on the goggles. Now for the blacks of the eyes, I will just get an absolute tiny bead of black on the end of a brush, and I want it to bead up because I just want to barely dot the black of the eye on top of the white. And if I have a bead at the end of the brush, like a little, droplet forming, then I can just barely touch the brush on the white of the eye and it'll look good. If you are starting on eyes, one thing that helped me a lot is, instead of trying to center them, just make them look one direction or the other. So you don't have to try to center the black, you can just make them look left or right and do it at the very edge of the white. Next up, I'm going to be using a mix of black and uniform gray for all of the black web gear and boots. So you can see I'm using an absolute garbage brush from Hobby Lobby for the boots, and then my thin brush for all the web gear. And if the web gear is really standing out, I'll use the side of the brush instead of the very tip. That makes it a little bit easier to catch high raised edges of the uniform. Oh my gosh, this is what happens when I talk way too much, but you can see I'm just using the thin brush to do all the web gear, any of the buckles and anything. Again, I'm not trying to go crazy with doing, metal colors and all the buckles and everything. I just want it to look good enough. And you can see here's the finished product with all the black web gear painted. I'll do the entrenching tool covers, the bayonet sheaths, any straps, drop the model again, and anything else that looks good, the Kar 98 pouches. So next thing here is we're going to be doing our first set of highlights. So I'm just taking that Vallejo German field gray, and I'm using a crappy brush, and I'm just going to be putting this on all of the high points of the model. So where that wash settled, that known oil wash, I am not going to be painting over with the Vallejo field gray. I'm just going to be using the same color. I'm not adding anything to it, and just going over all the high points of the model. So none of the creases where the known oil settled. I'm just going to be going over any high points, any large flat areas like these little collar tabs, and the little pockets he's got on his jacket. I'll hit the main center part of it with another coat of this field gray camouflage, and try to keep it away from the edges, and don't try to completely cover over top of large parts of the model. What I'm trying to do here is use this as kind of a highlight. The known oil is going to darken everything, and this is just going to add a very subtle highlight to the entire uniform. So anywhere where light might hit, I'll hit with just another quick coat. You don't have to go crazy with this. This is kind of where the artsy part of model painting comes in, is just kind of throw it on there. Don't look too much into it. The more perfectionist you're going to try to be, the more you're going to hate the model. So just kind of be casual about it. Just throw it on all the high points. You can see on the lower part here, throwing it on a high point. Not really spending too much time with it. Not really trying to be concerned of what it looks like. It is going to look pretty bad when you first put it on, but as the paint dries, you're going to kind of see what we're talking about. And then once we've done this base coat of the field gray over top of the normal oil wash, we'll actually mix some white and go over some of the really, really high points to really showcase the contrast on this model. Alrighty, so now we're going to do even more highlights of the uniform, and we're going to be mixing a little bit of white with the German field gray. I don't actually use any bright whites. I use Clorox white for almost everything. And so we're just going to be mixing a little bit of this. Again, less is more. You don't want a crazy amount of highlighting. You don't want, them to look like lines. You just want it to look like high points of the uniform. So I'm going to be using a non-crabby brush. I'm going to be using a nice thin brush, and the peaks of any of the creases and any other part of the uniform that I want to stand out, I will just very quickly hit with this color. So you can see here on the rolled up arm of the sleeve, the very top of the elbow, anything that's rolled up, I'll just do a little quick highlight of. Thin white lines is what we're looking for. And then on the bottom of the uniform, there's kind of a line that outlines the jacket. I'll do this highlight on that. On the little pockets on the top of the uniform, I'll do a highlight around all the creases of the pocket, just so you can see what the pocket is. On the collar tabs, I will do the entire collar tabs in this color, just because I want to be able to tell what things are. And so, if you're wanting to showcase a certain part of the model, use this brightest color, because that's where the eye is going to be drawn. Wherever there is the darkest and lightest color together, your eye's going to pick that up, and it's going to see the difference in the brightness. So I'll also do this kind of around some of the web gear, because what's going to happen, like I said, is the darker the web gear is going to contrast nicely with the highlight of the uniform, and you'll be able to see that web gear a little bit easier. And that's the goal, is we want to see all the effort we put into this model, and not just paint it and then wash it and throw it on the tabletop. I mean, maybe you want to do that. Maybe you're normal and don't want to spend 40 hours per model, but me, I'm a crazy person, so we're just going to spend so much time highlighting, because once these guys get wiped off the board, at least they're going to look good, getting absolutely murdered. Alrighty, so we're finishing up our highlights. You probably thought I disappeared because I stopped talking for more than 5 seconds. But the next thing we're going to do is we're going to throw some shading on the wood part of the models, and then also do the chin straps and some other small parts that we haven't done yet. You can see these models are almost done, and they're looking pretty decent. So pretty excited about that. We're going to be using this Citadel Contrast Gore Grunta fur for the wood. I'm going to thin that down with a bunch of water, just because it's not actually like a wash, but I'm going to treat it like a wash. Then we're going to use German Black Brown for any of the goggle straps and chin straps, and then we're going to use the German Camo Orange Ochre for some of the linked ammo. There's a guy that's reloading with a clip, and some of the ammo we're going to use to simulate brass. And then you can see there for about 5 seconds I showed you a blue color, and we're going to highlight the goggles with a blue color. And then for anybody who's got just a plain metal helmet, we're going to be doing a dry brush with ash gray, and then you can see there's lead belcher there, and we're just going to throw some highlights on some of the guns and metal. So real quick, you can see for the helmet, I did a little bit of a normal oil wash to highlight some of the dark areas, and then I did a dry brush of ash gray on the top, and that's it for the metal helmets. That's it. It's pretty easy. Now for the gun here, you can see I'm just taking that Citadel paint. I'll usually thin it down even a little bit more than this, and I'll pretty much just cover the whole rifle in this color. Just adds a little bit of contrast and, you know, makes the gun look a little bit more worn and a little bit more like wood. Some people will go through and add individual, you know, lines from the laminate wood that they used on these rifles. I don't want to do that because that takes too much time. If you're painting really early war guys, you might consider a darker brown, and as they used solid wood, and later on in the war they used a laminate wood. Now I'm using the German camo dark brown, I think is what it's called, for the chin straps. I'm using a very thin brush and really taking my time on the chin straps because I don't want it to go over the face very much, and I want that skeleton horde wash I used earlier to still show the contours of the face. So just be careful when you're using the chin strap, and then also I'll use that same brown for the goggle straps. I don't know if that's technically correct, but it sounds correct, and when I was looking at it I was like, they probably used a dark brown, it's probably not gray. So that's what we're doing here, and then we're just going around the helmet cover completely. Alrighty, so the next thing is I just mixed a little bit of that white with the German dark green that I used for some of the metal and just did a quick highlight on the little canteen there. Next thing, we're using some lead belcher just to quickly dot on some of the parts of the metal of the gun, just to help the gun stand out a little bit more. And, you know, if your model doesn't have a little bit of shininess to it, are you even actually painting? For the MG34, I'm going to use a lot of lead belcher on the gun. Gosh, I've never seen an MG34 that wasn't worn the heck out of. So, you know, especially on the Kar 98s, and I mean, even more so the MG34s, you're not going to use too much lead belcher. Those guns got used the heck out of, and the bluing just got worn away immediately. For the belted and linked ammunition, I'm just using that ochre orange to hit the tips and the butts of the bullets. I think technically they used steel-cased ammunition for some of the MGs, but, you know, we're going to use this just because you're going to be able to tell that it's brass. And for the very last part, I'm just going to use a little bit of Army Painter Uniform Gray just to add a couple little highlights on the black webbing. Again, just to make them stand out a little bit more, I'm going to just dot this over some places just to show some important spots. You know, really less is more with this, but we're just trying to make the web gear stand out a tiny bit more. Alright folks, thank you for watching. That's how I paint German Veteran Infantry. Hope you enjoyed it. I'm legally required to ask you to like and subscribe and share the video. And if you want to support me, I'm going to be doing a lot more videos. I've got a lot more lined up in the works. So if you like what you saw and want to support me, I do have a Patreon, which is down in the description. Or if you'd like, I also have a store at covworks.com, spelled with an E. You can go pick up some models. I've got Germans and Russians and all sorts of stuff on there, and so I will personally ship them myself. So thanks for watching, and we will catch you in the next one.